This episode, I'm joined by Glenn Cronin to discuss his book, Disenchanted Wanderer, the Apocalyptic Vision of Konstantin Leontiev, alongside discussions on Russian literature and Orthodox Christianity. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you would like to support the podcast, gain access to some exclusive content, and keep Hermitix going indefinitely, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Glenn Cronin, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Well, pleased to be here. Thank you, James.
We are going to be discussing your book, recently published, called Disenchanted Wanderer, the Apocalyptic Vision of Konstantin Leontiev. So this book, as I said to you, was sort of just, someone said to me, as happens every now and again now, someone said, look, this has been published, it will really interest you, you should try to talk to the author. And what I found within was a figure, Leontiev, who has been, as far as I can see, though you said there's been a few things written, but not for 50 years, someone who's been forgotten, who was in many ways, as I said on the blurb, and it's said throughout the book, a precursor to Nietzsche. Has this very fascinating relationship to Orthodox Christianity, a very fascinating relationship with faith in general, and also lives an extremely intriguing life. So before we jump in with the book, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how this all came about, because as I understand, it's been quite a journey.
Yes, well, in the late 80s, I was casting around for a subject on which to do my PhD thesis, and my tutor at that time, Donald Rayfield of the University of London, suggested that Leontiev was a neglected figure who would be worth looking into. So I completed the thesis by the end of the decade, early 1990. There didn't seem a lot of interest at that time in turning into a book. At least I couldn't find a publisher, and I had my career to make. So I left it, and I went and worked for the Department for Transport in London. I was there for 20 years. When I retired, some of my friends badgered me really to dust off the thesis and turn it into a book, which I did. I found, to my surprise, that really there hadn't been that much done on Leontiev in the West in the intervening period, so it was quite timely, and I was very lucky. I found the interest in the book in Cornell University in the States, and it's now been published under the imprint of the Northern Illinois University, which is associated with Cornell. There's been a lot of interest in Leontiev in Russia since Perestroika, a considerable amount, not so much in the West. So my book is really the first comprehensive study on Leontiev in about 50 years, although there have been a few quite interesting shorter articles published. So there we are.
I'm wondering, do you feel there was ever a connection between your background in Leontiev and I assume Russian literature and your work with the transport?
None whatsoever. No. We didn't have a lot to do with Russia. In transport. I did do a stint in civil aviation, but again, I didn't come across the Russians very much. And they always had a rule in Russia anyway that foreign negotiations had to be conducted in English. So there was little chance to use the language. So no, there was no real connection there, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, before we jump in with the book, I have to ask you the Hermitix question. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Well, I guess this was a bit of an icebreaker question, so I ought to be topical. I would pick Boris Johnson, Sue Gray, and Cressida Dick. I would like to get them in a room, possibly with thumb screws provided, and see if we could get some light shed on what on earth is going on with the Partygate business. Whether we would or not, I don't know. More heat than light, probably, but you never know. So yeah, they'd be my three for the moment.
So you're not a fan of the current government then?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think Boris has let us all down really with this. But then at least we have the advantage that if he had resigned 2 or 3 weeks ago, we wouldn't have the benefit of his expert diplomatic skills now in our negotiations with Russia over the Ukraine. So I guess every cloud has a silver lining.
I mean, yeah, I'm wondering just with your background as well then, I mean, how do you feel about this whole situation? Just to stay on that topic of sort of contemporary things, I suppose there's a very subtle connection there. But perhaps what do you think Leontiev would make of it as well?
I think Leontiev would have a titter watching it all. I mean, I worked closely with ministers in Whitehall during my career there. And I find the extraordinary mishandling of this issue quite astonishing, to be honest. I do wonder what's going on there. That the whole Number 10 organisation could have been so blind to the true situation in the country during COVID as to do anything of what they've been accused of doing is absolutely astonishing to me, and I think they deserve castigating for it, because they've certainly let the civil service down badly in what they've done, and shone a very, very poor light on the administration. So we'll see.
Well, perhaps those sort of contemporary quandaries will come up again in our discussion. But as we move into discussion of Konstantin Leontiev, as you know, many people will simply not have heard of him, which is unfortunate. Where can we situate him historically?
Okay, I'll keep this as short as practical. There's a main line of Russian thought really from the time of Peter the Great in the very early 18th century. A Europeanizing brand of thought. This went through Catherine the Great until the early part of the 19th century, when it provoked a reaction among Russians who were afraid that too much European influence would tend to drive out traditional Russian values and make Russia a kind of poor imitation of the West. And a group called the Slavophiles arose, and who were determined, if possible, to drag Russian culture back from the brink of Europeanization and develop a truly Russian culture, not necessarily opposed, but as different from Western Europe. Leontiev was right in the middle of this. I mean, his thinking is in many ways strongly influenced by European thought, but at the same time, his sympathies lie with the Slavophile tendency. Although in later life he fell out with the Slavophiles because he disagreed with their basic thesis, which was that the Slavic bloodline should be the decisive factor in determining the future Russian culture. Leontiev did not agree with racial Slavism. He postulated something that was closer to a pan-Orthodox culture, which he thought would have the dual effect of insulating Russia against excessive liberalism coming from Europe, and at the same time, hopefully, produce a renaissance in Russia in due course of an Eastern Orthodox, Slavic, Eurasian even mixture, which he thought would be the most culturally fruitful way forward.
So it seems to me that line of Slavophile thinking is still quite strong today in Russia.
Oh, absolutely. This from Peter the Great onwards, you had this great divide in Russia between Westernizers and Slavophiles, and you can see this very clearly in what's been going on since Putin came. You've got one faction dragging Russia to the east, and another faction trying to bring it further into the west, and we've got it now in the Ukraine. This where is the Ukraine to be? Is it going to be in the Russian eastern sphere of influence, or on the Western European sphere? Yes, it's very much alive.
So where did Leontiev ultimately end up, or did he remain, in that turbulent relationship until the end?
Yes, pretty much. He was always a lone voice, really. He was wrongly anathematized by the more liberal camp in Russia as a reactionary, which he wasn't, in fact. And on the other hand, the Slavophiles didn't like his attack on their Holy of Holies, which was the Slav bloodline. So yes, as often happens to independent thinkers, he fell between these two stools. He ploughed a lonely furrow, really, and died a lonely man.
Would he have been considered sort of a dissident by either side, or one of the sides?
Well, you didn't really have the concept of dissident in those days. I suppose he could have been seen as a dissident from the Slavophile point of view, yes, in his disagreement with some of their most cherished theses. He was an independent thinker, a very original thinker, and he didn't suffer fools gladly, and he wasn't afraid to tell people exactly what he thought, and he didn't always win him many friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it seems from the biographical overview that you give in the book that really his literary career, his writing career, begins with his relationship with the work of Turgenev, and but this relationship quite quickly, it seems, becomes he suddenly moves away from Turgenev and sort of almost distances himself from him.
Yes, when Leontiev first went to Moscow as a very young man, he met Turgenev, and he admired him very much as a man and as a writer. I don't think Turgenev had that much influence on the development of Leontiev's writing. I think, strangely enough, Western writers, particularly Georges Sand, for example, were a much greater influence. And of course, the famous Russian critic Vissarion Belinsky was also a big influence. I think you're going to go on to talk about Leontiev's idea of art for art's sake. I might as well cover it in this because it dovetails with it. In the 1850s, there was a strong current of opinion in Russia that the duty of an artist was not to create beautiful works of art, but to expose the failings in Russian society at the time. And there was a very famous journal called Sovremennik, which means the contemporary, edited by people like Chernyshevsky, which promoted this idea of art as a servant of ethical and social ideas. Leontiev wanted none of that. He believed very firmly that art had to be artistic first and foremost. And he used Turgenev's book On the Eve as a kind of vehicle for his own critique of the ideas being promoted by Sovereign. He suggested that On the Eve was an artistic failure because Turgenev had put too much emphasis on serving the social cause. Turgenev, I think, never really forgave him for this, actually, and became very cool towards Leontiev after that. And indeed, their relationship deteriorated quite quickly into acrimony on both sides. Turgenev suggesting that Leontiev should never have started writing at all, and Leontiev suggesting that Turgenev himself had destroyed his art through sort of slavish subservience to the latest trends. So that was the end of that, really, as far as they were concerned. I think Turgenev's got a point. I think Leontiev's fiction, his novels, are probably the weakest aspect of his work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it makes me wonder where Leontiev sort of stood in relation to how he understood objective and subjective values, right? Because he seemed, in this idea of beauty for Leontiev is something to be taken extremely seriously. And it seems to be that it's undermined by that idea of art for art's sake, right? Like beauty could just be something willy-nilly. So is that could that be basically considered for Leontiev the foundational objective value of perhaps meaning and purpose is beauty?
Well, up to a point. One of the strange things about Leontiev is that although he was strongly critical of Sovremennik and Chernyshevsky and Turgenev, in fact, for subordinating art to ethical ideas, if you like, he himself was never shy of doing exactly that. And most of his own fiction, they are novels of ideas, and he's not shy of filling them with his own moral outlook, if you like. I think we're going to come to that in a little while, actually. But he certainly believed, though, that there's a work of art needed to be first and foremost beautiful in some way, if it was to convey any meaning to anyone. Which is actually something that Belinsky himself had said, but people tended to forget that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for him, the production of this, which, as I understand it, though, perhaps I'm wrong in this, is perhaps quintessentially Russian. Is that for beauty to be sort of produced or to be able to get in touch with it, you have to have almost like a positive relationship with misery and with evil in a subtly sort of ascetic sense, right? That these things are almost fuel for beauty.
Yeah, I don't know if it's quintessentially Russian. It's quintessentially Leontiev, certainly. I don't think he would. Leontiev's sometimes seen as promoting evil, and I think that's not true. That's unfair. I think what he did say, though, was that if it was necessary in order to further the production of good and beauty, he would not seek to abolish it. He famously said in his book, A Place of One's Own, that if in order that we should have Cordelia, King Lear's daughter, the good daughter, if in order for her to appear, it was necessary we also had Lady Macbeth, he said, fine, let's have Lady Macbeth, and we'll have Cordelia too. The implication being, if you try to get rid of Lady Macbeth, you will also get rid of Cordelia. And So he was having a hit really at the 19th century utilitarian morality, the world improving morality, which he felt could all too easily turn out to actually destroy what was worth having in the world. The preservation of the beautiful and by implication the good was more important to Leontiev than promoting altruism. So he's a difficult thinker for many people. Difficult in the sense of hard to come to terms with. But he's very, very stimulating and thought-provoking.
Mm. I mean, that's quite a should we say a Christian position, which is somewhat swept under the rug, in spite of sort of just putting the niceties at the forefront. Whereas, let's say, for instance, that the evil, which in both the Orthodox and the Catholic tradition would be understood as, it's allowed by God. It's allowed in divine providence as something that God allows for the sake of the growth of men to become something more, or to go towards grace. Otherwise, the whole thing is meaningless, right? If you don't have the choice between good and evil, which we took for ourselves in the Garden of Eden, then it's all for naught, because you can't force faith. So I think, but I guess with Leontiev is that he's accentuating the point that the evil has to be a thing, and that's something to be fought with in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I did scribble down an excerpt, a short one from his book, A Place of One's Own. He's asked if his views would justify even violence, and his hero Milkeyev in the book says that you should justify it with beauty. He says that's the only reliable yardstick because it's an end in itself. Every struggle involves dangers, hardships, and pain, but man is higher than other creatures precisely because he finds pleasure in the struggle, in overcoming the hardships. So I think, he wouldn't have wanted life reduced to a banality. He enjoyed the struggle. And he thought it was the most productive thing in the long run.
Which is there wasn't too much of this in the book, but I got it's mentioned a few times, but I got the sense in relation to this struggle that he himself abided by a form of asceticism, and we'll get later to he has this sort of excursion, quite a short excursion really, to Mount Athos. And he doesn't stay there too long, but it seems that he always retained throughout his life a monastic form of personal living in relation to this idea of struggle.
He certainly did after. Leontiev's life really does divide into two halves. Before his excursion to Athos in 1871, and afterwards. Leontiev tried to live the aesthetic life when he was working for the Russian diplomatic service in European Turkey. And it's pretty clear that he didn't put much restraint on himself, notably in a sexual sense. Then he had this crisis when he was a Russian consul in Salonika. He thought he was dying, and he was clearly terrified by this experience and prayed to the Virgin to save him, and told her that if she did, he'd go to Mount Athos and get ordained as a monk. He did recover from the illness, and he did go to Athos, but the elders at Athos, probably rightly, said that he wasn't ready to take holy orders. But he did, after that time, cleave to a rigorously ascetic form of orthodoxy. And I think it was the one thing he believed could actually curb his tendency to excess and bring him ultimately to salvation, because he did become very, very concerned for the fate of his soul.
Mm-hmm. And this is really his lifelong struggle, all bundled into one, in a way, of this idea of as you said, beauty as a means to an end, ascetic struggles, and the struggle of faith in relation to the earlier part of his life with this sort of very overt sexuality and various other excesses. This struggle, which all seems to perhaps come under the title of faith in relation to these other things, of having a very sincere and quite strenuous form of faith in relation to all these things.
Yes, actually, that's an interesting way of putting it. I think sincerity is certainly one of his cardinal features. There was I don't know if you've come across a chap called Vasily Rozanov, who was a later, he was a younger contemporary. He became quite well known as a thinker in the early 20th century. He noted that Leontiev, he said, almost uniquely among Russian literary figures, had no guile in him. He was sincere, and in everything he did, you saw the man entire. He called him Adam without clothes. And yes, I mean, all the way through, he first with his aesthetic outlook and cult of beauty, and later on with orthodoxy, he was absolutely sincere in what he believed, and he did try to put it into practice, which of course caused him considerable grief over the years in one way and another. But yes, he was. You always saw the real man. It was there was no guile, no disguise there.
Mm. I mean, it was the question, right at the end there. But as we sort of brought it in, I mean, was there much documentation of his time at Mount Athos?
Only from him. He wrote an account of it. What I personally don't know whether any records of his time at Athos still exist on Athos. I doubt it personally. It's possible. But he was very honest in his account. I mean, he was quite upfront with the fact that the elders didn't consider him spiritually ready to become a monk, and told him to go back in the world. He eventually became a monk 4 years before his death, actually. He died in the famous Russian monastery of Sergei Posad, just outside Moscow, after living in equally famous Optina Pustin for about 4 years before that. I think it was possibly the happiest time of his life, actually.
What, the last 4 years as a monk?
Yeah. Yeah, it just comes across in his writing, in his letters, that he'd achieved some kind of peace.
Do you think so? So one thing that came through is that he has this struggle of Christian faith, but he has a struggle of faith towards Christianity as well, as if he's almost flirting with other things. Like he doesn't want to accept them, begrudgingly has to accept that there might be these other things. Do you think perhaps in those last 4 years he finally just became content and accepted the full truth of Christianity?
It's difficult, very difficult question. I doubt it. I doubt if he completely threw overboard the baggage of Islam and Buddhism that he'd picked up over the years. And how far was he actually a truly believing Orthodox Christian. It's very difficult to say, actually. Again, Rozanov said that he wasn't. He said he forced himself to believe in the Christian doctrine against every living impulse in him, Rozanov said. I think there's some truth in that. He wanted to believe, he wanted to save his soul, but he had a lot of trouble doing it.
Do you perhaps see that conversion story then where he said, if you save me, then I'll, go to Mount Athos? Do you see that as perhaps, I don't want to project it onto him, but perhaps he knew I'm probably going to survive here and this will give me the impetus to, and the reason to actually go do that, as a sort of a major external help. He's sort of forcing God's hand in a way.
No, I think he genuinely believed he was going to die. And in later life, his Orthodox faith was based upon the notion of the fear of God, the notion, rather Kierkegaardian, dread, the natural reaction of man to God is holy dread. And he said that this dread will in time breed love, and it's the only the best way anyway to attain to the love of God is through fear of him. It's why he fell out so badly with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in later life, because he saw their doctrine of love, what he called rose-tinted Christianity, as very, very not very useful. Actually, he predicted that this kind of Christianity would, in the end, lead either to revolution or to turning the church into something like a vehicle for social work. He didn't really want anything to do with their view of faith as based upon what you might call altruistic love. Leontiev's view was you fear first, you tremble, and then you love. But it's a different view.
Do you think he's been proven right?
Well, I don't think any of us can say really until we face our maker ourselves. I think it's a matter of personal choice, to be honest with you.
Oh, I meant he said about Tolstoy's form of love sort of, changing the church into something as a social task.
I think he was right. I mean, Tolstoy made a considerable contribution towards the eventual revolution in Russia through his scathing criticisms of the state-controlled church. Actually, that's one area where Leontiev had some sympathy with him. He thought the state had too much control of the church too. Lenin was quite prolific in his praise of Tolstoy later as one of the contributors and forerunners of the revolution. So, yeah, I think there was something in it, all right. But at the same time, I think Leontiev's extreme asceticism is difficult, I think, for most people. It's hard to emulate. I think you could be a bit kinder without turning the church into a vehicle for social work. I think you can try and meet Dostoevsky halfway somewhere.
When you say, I mean, asceticism itself is extreme anyway. When you say extreme, in what practical sense did that show itself?
Well, I think he's just asking too much of people to really to to turn your back on the world and reject the things of this life is hard. I think saints can do it and martyrs can do it, but the average chap in the street can't do it. And I think faith needs to be a bit kinder to the weaknesses in human beings, kinder than Leontiev was prepared to be. Although, having said that, not to create confusion, personally, and this is one of the ironies, is that almost everybody who knew Leontiev said what a nice and kind fellow he was, actually, in a personal sense, which contrasts so hugely with his rather severe doctrines that it's always been a puzzler for people, really.
I mean, that's something I was going to say, is that he seems to come across as someone quite cold in this sense, but perhaps not.
Not at all. No, he was not a cold fellow. He had strong family relationships. His wife, he stood by his wife for many, many years, even though she became seriously mentally ill. He had close friends, and as I say, his acquaintance, people who knew him, liked him. He was not the kind of man you would immediately get from just a perusal of his writings. He was a much warmer individual than you might think, actually.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he was lonely? At
times, yes. As I say, his wife became seriously mentally ill. He was cold-shouldered by a lot of the Slavophiles who he saw as his natural allies. He did feel isolated and lonely at times, particularly towards the end of his life, or at least in the period, as I say, up to the time when he became a monk. After that, I think he was reconciled to life. He died quite young. I mean, he's only 61. But after his experience before Athos, he was more or less chronically ill for the rest of his life with various ailments, actually. So he was not a well man.
I'm going to assume he sort of saw those as a test or something to, struggle with.
I guess he did. He doesn't say a lot about them. They were a test for him. Yes, they stopped him working at times, which he found difficult. I suppose he did see them as one of the things that we have to cope with. Yes.
So thus far, I mean, people who hadn't come across him might think of Leontiev primarily as perhaps a novelist or a writer or a literary figure, but as is sort of emphasized in the book as well, I mean, he is a philosopher of sorts. So, I mean, in what sense can we consider Leontiev a philosopher?
Not really. He's not a philosopher. In fact, he was quite open about that. He said, how do you put it? He said, he's not one of these people who can spin metaphysical ideas out of themselves as a spider spins silk out of it to make its web. He was a political thinker first and foremost, and his great theme, almost say obsession, was the development of culture from birth through flowering to decay, and what conditions would produce a flowering culture and what would hinder the production of it and what would cause its demise. So I think his chief contribution, shall we say, to Russian thought is precisely this social, political evolutionary theory, which was very much in the air anyway in the 19th century. I mean, social Darwinism, so to speak. It eventually culminated, and I think you mentioned this, in Oswald Spengler, for example, the decline of the West. I was going to mention another chap actually called Pitirim Sorokin, who's not so well known as Spengler, but was in fact quite an extraordinary figure. He was a Russian. He actually served as Kerensky's private secretary in the provisional government in 1917. He fled to America to escape death at the hand of the Bolsheviks, and eventually set up the Harvard School of Sociology, of all things. And then in the late 1930s, he undertook the most extraordinary investigation of precisely the cultural dynamics that Leontiev himself had been looking at nearly 100 years before, or certainly 70 years before, using, as far as I can see, dozens of undergraduates and postgraduates to ferret out almost every cultural icon from the time of the pharaohs. So, I mean, yeah, there was a strong trend of this trying to penetrate the causes of cultural birth, flowering, and decay. And Leontiev was one of the very early contributors to that. Alongside a contemporary, Nikolai Danilevsky, who's probably better known, but had a similar theory. They worked on similar lines. So yeah, that's probably the most interesting aspect of Leontiev.
So, not as to sort of condense something which is probably a far more complex, but what for Leontiev specifically did he ever come to a conclusion as to what the causes were for, the birth, flowering, and then the decay of civilizations?
Yes, he did. He had and this to our modern eyes is problematic, but he drew a parallel with the natural world, particularly plants, and he would say that you get a seed, say it's an acorn, and if this acorn falls into good soil, it will eventually produce an oak tree, and the oak will grow and it will flower and it will flourish for a while, and then it will cease to flourish. And why will it cease to flourish? And this is where it becomes more problematic than ever. He says that the constituent parts of the oak tree no longer wish to be an oak tree. They wish to take on their own individual destinies, if you like, and not realizing that they will thereby destroy the tree which is giving them sustenance. The parallel he's actually drawing there is with the rise of economic and social liberalism in Western countries, which he really didn't like and didn't want to see come to Russia, because he thought that European societies, which had reached their ultimate pitch of flowering in the Renaissance, then along came the Age of Enlightenment, and out of that flowed modern doctrines of liberalism, which he thought were causing the West to disintegrate and implode. And it was the fate that he wanted to preserve Russia from. Of course, hasn't quite worked out like that, but that was his view of things. He thought Europe didn't have much of a future, actually.
Well, I'll put my neck on the line and say that I think he's probably mostly right there.
Well, he's got a point, yes. And of course, we sit in the middle of the process. We haven't got God's perspective on things. So yes, he was right about a lot of things. He made a lot of prophecies, particularly about things like Bolshevism, Stalin, Nazism. He didn't call them that, but there's a Russian writing after Perestroika, I can't remember his name now, he said that one thing you have to think about with Leontiev, whether you love him or hate him, that most of what he said came right.
Those are the people you can't ignore.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, was this sort of internal decay, towards individualism, was this, determinist? Was this completely a foregone conclusion for Leontiev?
Oh, yes, he was very deterministic. Yes, he, in fact, so much so that he I already mentioned that he was ostracized by the Slavophiles. He later became ostracized by the conservatives in Russia because he said precisely that reaction is pointless. You can't stop this process, he said. Once it's started, once the process of decay has started, it will carry on. But, he said, you can slow it down. So his recommendations to the persons of power and influence in St. Petersburg were to implement as many measures as you could, which would slow the process of decay. It will not stop it, he said, and don't try to stop it because you'll just make it go quicker. But you can channel it. And his great thing, actually, the channel he wanted to see it was Byzantium and Byzantinism. He was desperate, in fact, that Russia should conquer and annex the city of Constantinople, which was obviously the home of the Byzantine Empire, the cradle of Eastern Orthodoxy. And he felt that if Russia could annex Constantinople and shift its capital there from St. Petersburg, that might trigger a flowering of culture which might show that Russia was still on the up curve rather than on the way down. Of course, the Tsar and the ministers wanted nothing of that. It never came to fruition, but that was his dream. It became pretty much an obsession with him, actually.
I mean, that's what I was going to ask. Sort of what if you to bundle everything together of Leontiev with this sort of Christian optimistic pessimism. It's decaying, but we can find ways to slow the decay, right? What? Perhaps a better question there would be, within that, what for Leontiev should be the purpose of the individual man? Or did he never, seek to sort of define that?
No, he does. If you go back to the novel A Place of One's Own, which was 6 years before his conversion on Athos, he goes into some detail about that. His view, I guess, of the purpose of the individual is to contribute as much as he or she can to the cultural flowering of the society in which they live. And this, of course, is where Nietzsche comes in, really. Mm-hmm. As I say, Leontiev was not a philosopher. And the whole read across to Nietzsche actually boils down to this one passage in this one book, actually, where the hero is an extreme individualist. I tell you what, it reminds you. I don't know if you know Ayn Rand.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Atlas Shrugged, and the chap's name escapes me. John Galt.
Yeah.
That's it. Milkeyev in A Place of One's Own is very much a Galt figure, actually, and he says at one point that life and death don't matter as long as you do what you have to do and contribute your bit and live. Then you'll have achieved everything that someone can achieve. And he goes on to talk about the developed and underdeveloped man. And there's a character in the book who's obviously personifies the underdeveloped man as well. And of course, a lot of this really does seem to look forward to Nietzsche and Also sprach Zarathustra and the Übermensch, the supra, well, the upper man. But to be honest, I think that's as far as it goes, really. But of course, it's such a striking thing that it's been picked up on by all commentators on Leontiev ever since all the Rozanov in the 1890s, I think, was the first to notice this. You can't ignore it. And it's interesting that Leontiev should be writing these things 20 years before Nietzsche. And as far as I can ascertain, I'm almost certain that neither man knew the other or anything of them. So it's quite I call it convergent evolution in the book. Two people faced with the same dilemma, the same circumstances, produce the same result. Mm-hmm. But that's as far as it goes, I think.
So do you think that sort of allusion to Nietzsche is just a way to, find a figure, you say, well, you don't know much about this person, but they're like this person that you do know, whereas really perhaps it's a bit almost damaging to do that, and the two should be, left where they're in their own context?
Well, I think that's easy to fall into that. I think some people have in the past written books, Leontiev, a Russian Nietzsche, which is really building on a very narrow foundation. No, I think it's as I say, it's so striking, this particular parallel, that you can't ignore it, and it's just very interesting. I, as a bit of, in a way, as a bit of fun, I mentioned in the book that it's also very redolent of the film The Third Man, and this notorious cuckoo clock analogy that Harry Lime propounds, that the Borgias and the Renaissance were horrible people, but they produced this wonderful outpouring of art, whereas the Swiss are very nice people, and they produced the cuckoo clock. And funnily enough, Milkeyev says something very, very similar in the book. He even mentions the Renaissance, and he even mentions Switzerland. It's quite intriguing, because nobody really knows where this cuckoo clock analogy came from in The Third Man. Harry, what's his name, Orson Welles, said he thought it came from an old Hungarian play, but wasn't more specific than that. Whether it came from Leontiev, who knows? We'll never know. But it's a very, very similar extract.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, on that note, face to face with someone such as Nietzsche, who's obviously been remembered, why has Leontiev, if you agree, been forgotten?
Well, I think there's probably several reasons for that. First of all, Nietzsche created a huge, a much larger oeuvre of very, very provocative works. Also, of course, Nietzsche was writing in the West. He was writing in German. He was, although a strange outgrowth in his own way, I suppose, he was in the mainstream of European philosophical thought, running through Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche. Leontiev was writing in Russia. in a different language, in a different alphabet, in a different society. And then came the revolution, of course, and he was completely a non-person under the Soviet regime. And of course, that hitherto, not many of his works have been translated into Western European languages. Although I was pleased to say that the same year as my book came out, last year, in fact, a new translation of his main socio-political treatise, Byzantinism and Slavdom, was published in English, which is a very useful development, actually. Mm. It may allow more people to get closer to him.
Is that where you'd sort of advise people to begin? I mean, I guess there's not too many places for the Westerner to begin unless they speak Russian. Well, your own book, of course.
They should begin with my book, obviously. My book's a good place. There are some other studies in English, which I mention in the bibliography to my book. Nicholas Berdyaev is one who wrote a very interesting study of Leontiev back in the 1920s. Otherwise, this new translation by a chap called, he signs himself K. Benoit, Benois. I don't know anything about him apart from that. I couldn't find anything out about him. But he's made this translation, and that would be a very useful thing for people to read. I think it would give you a lot of Leontiev in there, yeah. Mm. And there are one or two things floating around in English, but not a great deal.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about Leontiev or your book that you feel we haven't touched upon? Obviously, it goes without saying that there's much more within your book.
Yeah, it's a jolly good read. No, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. I think he is a very interesting man. He had an interesting life, and he wrote a lot of very provocative and provocative articles, which I think shed light not just on what was going on in his day, actually, but also what's going on in ours as well, because obviously anyone who wants to get inside the mind of Vladimir Putin, for example, Leontiev isn't a bad place to start, because all the things that have gone to make up the modern Russian mindset really are there in Leontiev. The Slavophile Europeanizer debate we touched on earlier, the Orthodox mentality, even the tendency, which has always been in Russia, towards authoritarianism and autocracy, which is clearly there in Putin. All these things are there in Leontiev too, and also there's a lot of debate in Leontiev between the relative merits of liberalism and conservatism, which really are pretty alive today in the West when you think of the likes of Trump and the anti-Trump camp. So yeah, I mean, he's an interesting guy, and he would repay reading for anyone who wants to get into these things.
So if you want maybe a subtle vision of the future, dive into some Leontiev. There might be a few more predictions that have yet to come true.
Yeah, well, he made plenty of predictions about Stalin. Didn't mention him by name, but you can see he talks about the new Constantine the Great, who will seize the banner of socialism in the way Constantine seized the banner of Christianity and lead Russia to a new renaissance. He feared the forthcoming conflict with Germany. There's plenty in there. There's plenty in there to ponder. But I think you're right. I think he's he is a way into the Russian mind. And for anybody who wants to study the Russian mind and is interested, in Putin and what's going on out there, he's as good as anyone, actually, for that.
Mm-hmm.
And better than most, eh?
Okay. Well, obviously this was your PhD from a long, long time ago. I mean, are you, since this publication, are you, should we say, motivated to write some more, or are you working on anything else, or is this...
Towards the end of his life, Leontiev came into personal contact with a chap called Lev Tikhomirov.
Mm-hmm.
He's another interesting guy. He was a terrorist in his youth. He was part of the People's Will group who assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Tikhomirov fled abroad and then petitioned the new Tsar to be let back into Russia, and they agreed. And he came back and became a staunch monarchist and a defender of autocracy and orthodoxy. And I'm looking at him. I think there's a book there waiting to be written. And, well, it's early days, but we'll see what comes of it.
That sounds extremely interesting. I'd definitely love to read it. That seems like a good place to finish up. So, Glenn Cronin, thanks very much. It's been great. And also, I'll be sure to put the links for where to find your book in the description. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. It's been a pleasure.